The god of order came to erase me on a Tuesday. I heard his footsteps rising through the tower, one step at a time, slow, like a man who wasn't in a hurry to keep an appointment. I kept eating my bread. Outside, the kingdom sang. The hymns bled through the stone, voices lifted to celebrate his descent. All things in their place, all things defined. I was the only thing in the tower that had no place. The door opened. The high priest entered first.
It is here. As you can see, it has been quiet. We ensured it would not contaminate the world beyond.
I tore the bread into 2 pieces, dipped one in salt. Then he walked in. He carried something with him. I didn't have a word for it then. Later I would learn it was definition. Where he stood. Things remembered what they were. Air grew still. Stone recalled it was stone. He looked at me. I looked at him. He frowned.
You do not fit.
I chewed. Swallowed. He walked toward me, no hesitation, no fear. Like a man approaching a door. Doors belonged where they were. Doors opened when pushed. His fingers touched my forehead, cold, precise. I felt something sweep through my body, a light, searching for what I was. Then the light slid off his fingertips. He stopped. His frown deepened. He tried again. Nothing caught. I finished the bread in my mouth, swallowed. First time?
He pulled his hand back, looked at his fingertips, like something should have been there. Nothing. He raised his head. His gold eyes held something I hadn't seen before. A crack. What are you?
Guess. He came back the next day, and the day after. Each time the same. Fingers to my forehead, light sweeping, nothing catching. Each time he rowed like I was a lock he couldn't pick. I started carving marks into the wall, visits. 1, 2, 3. You keep coming back.
I said on the 4th visit. I am studying you.
Studying requires questions. He paused. His hand hovered near my temple.
Very well. How do you erase definition?
I don't do anything. Things just stop being what you think they are.
That is not an answer.
It's the only one I have. He stayed silent after that. Touched my forehead again. Failed again. Left without another word. On the 5th visit, Mira brought my meal. She set the tray down and wouldn't look at me. They're planning a celebration. For what? Her jaw tightened. For after. When you're purified, they'll make it a holy day. I picked up the bread. Children will be released from lessons. There will be a market. Do you believe them? That I'm a plague? Mira looked at the floor. I didn't wait for an answer. I already had it. Later, when Aethel came, he stood by the window. The hymns had started again outside.
Your existence does not conform to order.
What is order?
Play structure. Definition.
Who decided what gets defined and what doesn't? His eyes narrowed.
The authority is inherent.
Who says? He had no answer. I carved the 5th mark into the wall after he left. My fingers lingered on the stone. Then I put the bread down and went to sleep.
You ask many questions.
You ask none.
I am not the one being studied.
I laughed. The sound surprised even me. It echoed off the stone. You think you're studying me, but you're the one who keeps coming back. You're the one who can't stop touching my forehead. You're the one who stares at his own fingers afterwards. He said nothing. What are you looking for? Your definition. And when you can't find it? He turned toward the window. The evening light caught his silver hair.
Then you are an anomaly that requires correction.
Correction. Not understanding. Correction.
Those are the same thing.
I almost laughed again. Almost. No. They're not.
The door opened. The high priest stepped inside.
His eyes swept past me like I was furniture.
My lord, you spend much time here. The council wonders about the delay.
There is no delay. I am studying it.
It is not a thing to be understood. It is an error to be removed. You risk contamination by prolonged exposure.
Ethel's jaw tightened, barely. I only noticed because I was watching.
I am aware of the risks.
Are you? Because it seems to me...
I know what it is.
The words hit the room like a stone into still water. I was standing by the door. They didn't see me. They never did. I blinked twice. Walked back to my bed. Lay down. On the wall, the 6th mark was dry. He didn't come on the 7th day. I sat by the wall and waited. The bread grew cold. I ate it anyway. When he finally came, he didn't touch my forehead. He walked to the window and stood with his back to me.
The council has questions.
About me.
About the delay. About why definition continues to fail.
I watched his shoulders. The way they didn't move. What did you tell them?
Nothing. There is nothing to tell.
Outside, the city bells rang. Somewhere far below, people were going home to dinners and families and lives that had never been interrupted by a god's indecision.
Perhaps they were right.
I had been tearing bread. My hand stopped.
Perhaps you are simply an error that requires correction.
The breadcrumbs fell from my fingers. They hit the stone without sound. I looked at the wall. 7 marks. 1 for every time he had come. 1 for every time I had let him try. I looked at his back. He hadn't turned around. Maybe you're right. He didn't respond. He didn't turn. He didn't see me put my hand down. He didn't see me not carve the 8th mark. He didn't see me lie down and close my eyes. He never would. He came again the next day. I was sitting in the same spot. The bread was fresh. Mira had brought it without meeting my eyes. Ethel stood in the doorway.
You didn't ask me to leave.
He said, "No."
You always ask something.
I picked up the bread, tore it. "There's no point," I said. He didn't move. The silence stretched until it filled the room like water.
You're different.
I'm the same.
No, you're not.
I looked at him. Really looked.
Silver hair catching the thin light. Gold eyes searching for something he still couldn't name.
I'm not your puzzle. I'm your boundary. You touch me and you learn where you stop. He flinched. Barely. A tightening around his eyes.
I am trying to understand you.
No. You're trying to define me. Those are not the same thing. He opened his mouth, closed it. Come back tomorrow, or don't. I'm not going anywhere. He left. The door closed. I heard his footsteps pause outside. Then nothing. I finished my bread. He came back. I didn't ask why. He stood by the window again, but this time he faced me.
When did you first erase a definition?
The question caught me off guard. Not what are you, not why do you resist? A real question. I don't know. Maybe I always did. Maybe from the moment I existed.
That's not an answer.
It's the truth. I didn't learn it. It just happened. Things around me would forget themselves. A spoon would stop being a spoon. A word would stop meaning what it meant.
And they locked you here.
They locked me here before I could speak. Before they knew what I could do. They just knew I was wrong. He was quiet. Why are you asking this?
Because I cannot define you. And I need to understand why.
Why? He didn't answer. Mira came with the evening meal. She set it down and paused. He looks at you differently, she said, quiet enough that only I could hear. How? I don't have a word for it, but it's different. She left. I ate.
Ethel stayed by the window until the light died. When he finally moved towards the door, tomorrow, he left.
That night, I didn't look at the wall. I already knew. There were only 7 marks. The tower was coldest in the hours before dawn. I couldn't sleep. The 7th mark kept appearing behind my eyelids every time I closed them. I got up, walked to the wall, put my palm against the stone. Cold, rough, real. My forehead followed. I pressed it against the granite until the chill seeped into my skull. My breathing changed. 3 breaths. Ragged, broken, the kind of sound I never let anyone hear. I stayed like that. Palm flat, forehead pressed, breathing wrong. Then I straightened. I pulled my hand back, let it fall to my side, walked to the bed, lay down, closed my eyes. When Mira came with the morning bread, I was sitting by the window. Today looks nice. She studied me, longer than usual. You look the same. I am the same. She set the tray down. He asked about you this morning, before the council. He wanted to know if you had eaten. What did you tell him? That you always eat, even when the bread is cold. Almost. Good. She left. I watched the light crawl across the floor. Somewhere outside, Ethel was standing at the base of the tower. I didn't know that then. I would learn it later, from Mira, who saw him there, staring up at the stone like it held an answer he couldn't name. He didn't come that day, but he stood there, and for the first time in eternity, he asked himself a question he couldn't define. Why am I here? 3 days passed before the high priest came, with more than prayers.
The council has decided, he announced from the doorway.
Ethel stood behind him, silent.
The purification will take place at the divine court. All clerics and nobles will bear witness.
I didn't look at him. I was watching the light on the wall.
The God of order will correct this error himself. Order will be restored.
Ethel said nothing.
Bring it.
The high priest told the guards. Mira stepped forward before they could touch me. I'll walk with her. The high priest's mouth tightened, but he nodded. We descended the tower stairs. My legs remembered each step. I had climbed them only once before, when they brought me here. I was too young to remember the sky. Then the door opened. Light! Not the thin light that bled through high windows. Real light. Sunlight. It hit my face and I stopped walking. What is it?
I didn't answer. I was looking up. My eyes stung. I squinted. The sky was... I didn't have a word for that colour. I had heard the word blue, but it meant nothing until now.
Is she unwell?
She's never seen the sun.
The guards shifted. The high priest looked impatient. Aethel was watching me. I lifted my hand. Light pooled in my palm. I turned it over, watched dust drift through the beam.
You will do what you have to do.
He didn't answer. I followed the guards toward the carriage. Behind me, Aethel hadn't moved.
I followed the guards toward the carriage. Mira glanced back once. He's still watching you, she whispered. I didn't turn around.
They kept me in a chamber near the divine court. Still stone. Still locked. But the window was larger. And I could see the city below. Mira came at night. They're preparing something else. She kept glancing at the door. For the ceremony. The high priest has a contingency.
What kind of contingency? I don't know. I heard him speaking to the guards. He said if the God of Order cannot complete the purification, they will. I waited. He's afraid. Of you. Of what you mean. Of what it means if he can't... Define me.
Yes. I picked up the bread from my tray, tore it, dipped it in salt. Okay. Okay? That's all? I chewed. Swallowed. What do you want me to say?
That you're afraid. That you have a plan. That you... something. I don't have a plan,
I said.
I've never had a plan. I've only ever been here.
She was quiet.
But I'm not afraid. Not anymore. Why?
I looked at the window. The city lights were small and far away. People were living down there. People who believed I was a plague. People who would celebrate my purification.
Because he's already failed. Every time he touches me, he fails. He fails. He can't define me. That's not my problem. That's his.
Mira said nothing.
And if they try to do what he can't, they'll learn the same thing. What thing? I tore another piece of bread.
That I'm not the one who's broken. The divine court was full. I had never seen so many people. Robes and jewels and faces turned towards the desk where I stood. The high priest stood at the altar, arms raised.
Today, order is restored. Today, the error that has plagued this kingdom since its birth will be corrected. The God of Order himself will perform the purification. Bear witness.
The crowd murmured. Somewhere a child asked a question and was shushed. Aethel ascended the dais. He walked like a man approaching something he had avoided for too long. He stopped in front of me. The room held its breath. I looked at him. He looked at me. His fingers rose toward my forehead, the same gesture he had made a dozen times in the tower. Then he lowered his hand.
I cannot define her.
The words dropped into the silence like stones. Murmurs rippled the crowd. The high priest's smile frozen.
My lord!
I have tried.
Every day. Every touch.
My authority, the power to name and fix all things, slides off her like water from oil.
He turned to face the assembly.
I cannot define her. Therefore, I must redefine definition itself.
The high priest stepped forward.
You cannot! This is heresy!
I am order.
Ethel's voice did not rise. It didn't need to.
What I speak becomes definition. She is not an error. She is what exists beyond the boundary of my authority. The flaw is not in her. The flaw is in a definition that cannot hold her.
He looked at me.
I do not know what you are,
He said.
and I have decided that is acceptable.
I stood in the center of the dais, white dress, bare feet, 100 eyes on me. For the first time in my life, I lifted my head in front of a crowd. I didn't smile. I was just seen. The high priest's voice cracked through the silence.
She has contaminated him!
He turned to the crowd, arms spread, robes billowing.
Do you not see? This is what chaos does. It infects, it corrodes.
The God of order stands before you and speaks heresy against his own nature.
That is not revelation. That is corruption.
No one moved.
She is a
He
plague.
continued. His voice was rising now, losing its practiced calm.
She was a plague in the tower and she is a plague here. He cannot see it because she has blinded him.
He is standing right here.
It was Mira. She hadn't spoken loudly, but in the silence her voice carried.
He can hear you.
She said,
He is not possessed. He is not corrupted. He is choosing. The high priest's mouth opened and closed. Aethel turned to me. You asked me once what I am.
I did.
You still don't know.
No.
Are you sure you can live with that? Defining everything except me.
Something flickered in his gold eyes. Not doubt. Something older than doubt.
I am already living with it.
He said. I held his gaze. Then you understand. I'm not the one who needed to change. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind him, the high priest was still speaking. His words had become a stream, a flood, a desperate thing throwing itself against silence and breaking.
The order of the world!
No one was listening. They were watching Aethel. And they were watching me.
The high priest's voice finally stopped. He looked around the room, at the nobles who had once deferred to him, at the clerics who had once echoed his every word. No one met his eyes. He opened his mouth one more time. Nothing came out.
They led the high priest away before sunset. Mira told me later when she brought bread to my new chamber, a room with a door that opened from the inside. He kept talking, she said, even as they walked him out, explaining, justifying. No one answered. What will happen to him? Exile. Or something like it. The council is still deciding. His followers have already begun distancing themselves. By morning, they'll claim they never truly believed him.
He spent his whole life protecting order. His version of it. Yes. And now order doesn't want him.
Mira was quiet.
The cleric who announced his removal
Told him something. Before the doors closed. He said, you taught us order. But you never taught us that order could have flaws. I chewed, swallowed. Will you go see him? Before he leaves? I looked out the window. The sky was doing that thing again. That color I still didn't have enough words for. Clouds moved across it. Slow. Unconcerned.
No. No. He doesn't need me to see him. He needs to know I don't care enough to look.
Mira nodded slowly. Later, she left. I finished the bread. I watched the clouds until they turned pink, then gray, then disappeared into the dark. Somewhere in the city below, the high priest was sitting in a bare room, waiting to be told where he would spend the rest of his life. I didn't think about him. I thought about the sky. How it had been there my whole life, just above the tower, and I had never seen it. Now I could. That was enough. The days after felt strange. Not because anything had changed, because nothing had. The sun still rose. The bells still rang. People still went to markets and prayers and beds that held the same bodies. They had always held. Ethel still came, not to study me. Not anymore. He came and stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to enter.
You can come in.
I said the third time. He stepped inside, stood by the window. The same window he had stood beside in the tower. Only now, there were no bars.
I keep defining things.
What things?
Everything. The wall, water, my own hand.
He looked at his palm.
Every time it works, every time I touch something and know what it is.
You remember the one time it didn't? He was silent. Mira found me later, in the garden. Real grass. Real dirt. I didn't know what to do with the feeling. He's different. He's the same. No, he's not. I asked him once what it felt like. What did he say?
He said it felt like reaching for a step that wasn't there. The shock of it, the lurch, and then something else.
What?
He said it felt like relief.
I didn't answer. He's been the god of order for eternity. Always knowing. Always certain. And you were the first thing that let him stop. I dug my fingers into the dirt. It was cool and damp and full of things I couldn't see. What does he do now? He waits. For what? Mira looked at me. For you to decide if you're coming back. I found him at the edge of the garden, where the grass stopped and the wild ground began. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing, like he had learned how to do that without a purpose. I crouched down, dug my fingers into the earth. It gave under my nails. Come here. He walked over, stood above me.
Get down.
He hesitated, then lowered himself to the ground. His robes, white and gold and always clean, pressed into the dirt. I scooped up a handful of soil, roots and pebbles and something small and wriggling. I held it out. What is this? I asked. He looked at the dirt in my palm. He could have told me its composition, mineral content, the exact names of every particle. He could have defined it down to its smallest truth. He didn't.
I don't know.
I let the dirt fall between my fingers. Good. He watched it scatter.
Will I always not know?
He asked. I don't know. I stood up, brushed my hands on my dress. The white fabric smeared brown. That's the point, I said. I started walking. Not away, just walking. The grass was wet, my footprints pressed into the ground behind me. I didn't tell him to follow. I didn't tell him not to. He stayed where he was, sitting in the dirt, robe stained, hands empty, watching me walk toward the trees. He didn't call my name. He didn't try to define where I was going. He just waited. And I knew, not because he had told me, not because anyone had, but he would wait as long as I needed. Not because he understood waiting, because he had stopped needing to understand everything. I reached the tree line. put my hand on the bark. It was rough, real, alive in a way stone had never been. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I knew he was there.
And for the first time in my life, that was enough.